Hi, I'm Laura Flanders, and you're watching CityWorks, the show for, with, and about working people in New York. CityWorks is a co-production of the School of Labor and Urban Studies at the City University of New York and CUNY TV. I'm Laura Flanders. This week, we're going to be talking about immigration with Cristina Jimenez of United We Dream and Kazi Fozia of Drum. She's a worker organizer in the South Asian community right here in Queens, New York. But first, Ruth Milkman. She's a professor at the School of Labor and Urban Studies, and she's just out with a new book that contests some of the basic narratives that we've been hearing about immigration and the threat to workers. You keep contesting our conventional ways of thinking about issues having to do with labor, and for that, I thank you. Let's start with this immigrant threat narrative. It seems to make sense to a lot of people that their work lives deteriorated and the wealth gap grew right as a whole lot of immigrants started showing up in our culture and in our workplace. But you say correlation is not causation. And in fact, we may have the entire story backwards. Start with what the narrative traditionally is thought to be.
Okay, so the standard narrative, which we've heard a lot of from various elected politicians, including the president in recent years, is that immigrants take jobs away from Americans. They bring crime to the United States that wouldn't otherwise be present. And they cost a lot of money in terms of healthcare, welfare, and so on. That's the standard conservative narrative. I would call it an immigrant narrative. And it's true, as you mentioned, that a lot of the ways in which the lives of US-born workers have changed in recent years occurred at the same time as immigrants arrived in this country in large numbers since the 1970s, basically. Immigration law changed in 1965, and it took a little while, but starting in the 70s, you start to see large numbers of new arrivals from Latin America, Asia, and so on. And in that same period, real wages for US-born workers, actually for all workers, began to decline. Real wages means controlling for inflation. We started to see large numbers of factory closings, unions declining, inequality skyrocketing, and so on. All those things did happen, and the economic situation of US-born workers has in fact deteriorated in that same period. But what I argue in the book is that employers, not immigrants, are responsible for those changes.
So what about deunionization? Because that's the other big piece of people's lives that seems to have changed.
Yeah, and deunionization has, the decline of labor unions has contributed a great deal to growing inequality because in general, union members earn more than non-union workers for all kinds of reasons. That's part of the point of organizing unions, right? And that's been quite effective historically. But starting in the 70s, and especially in the 80s after the famous strike of the nation's air controllers when President Reagan fired them all en masse after they went on strike in 1981, that's usually seen as the big turning point. It actually starts a little earlier, but in any case, employers kind of go on the rampage to try to eliminate unions or to weaken them or to prevent them from rising up in new workplaces in that period. And that does lead to declines in wages, the evaporation of pensions, for example, which I think many viewers will know firsthand, worse or no healthcare benefits tied to those jobs. And that happens in a lot of place-bound industries, not manufacturing. It happens too, but the manufacturing, the main problem is the jobs are disappearing. In other industries, there's plenty of jobs. Think of construction, for example, which actually booms in the 1980s and more recently too, until the 2008 crash anyway. Lots of jobs, but those jobs are increasingly non-union jobs. And that is a more complex story because in that industry, construction, there are a lot of immigrant workers in the non-union sector. But what I try to show in the book, and I think for construction, the story is pretty clear, it's that in construction, as unions are attacked and weakened, union workers in that industry, who are mostly white US-born men, say, I'm not going to do this job if it pays half what it used to and I don't get any benefits. I'm out of here. And they do move on.
I've been talking primarily about male-dominated workplaces, but your book also talks about women-dominated areas of service, domestic work, and so on. There too, you say that it isn't that immigrant workers pushed out US born workers who'd had those jobs, but rather they'd left. What's your evidence?
Well, that's a great, I'm so glad you brought that up because the story is quite different for women workers because women were never really fully included in the good jobs boom that existed in the post World War II years. They were always somewhat marginal. You know, we all know about the gender gap in pay and so on. And that was especially true for women of color. African American women were the main group of women of color prior to the new immigration starting, starts in the 70s. So what else happened in this period? In the 1960s, we all know very well, there was a major civil rights movement, and that actually won path-breaking legislation to prohibit race discrimination in employment. The Civil Rights Act did that with Title VII in 1964. There was also an Equal Pay Act, which was less effective the year before, that was supposed to guarantee equal pay for equal work on the basis of sex. So all these changes are occurring in this period just prior to the arrival of a lot of new immigrants. And for African American women in particular, who were the overwhelming majority at that time of paid domestic workers, I mean by that, housekeepers, nannies, elder care workers, people like that, that was mostly an African American female job. When the civil rights movement emerged, it opened up all kinds of new opportunities for that population of women. Now, these were not good jobs that were, made worse by employers. They were always crummy jobs. Black women didn't really participate in the good old days, of middle-class jobs, so-called, for people without a lot of higher education. But what happened in that era is that other jobs opened up to them. They could get clerical jobs, sales jobs, service jobs, from which they had previously been mostly excluded. And they poured out of domestic work into those jobs. So employers, in this case households, turn to immigrants who are arriving, in significant numbers in this period and need work.
So how does knowing all of this help us? I mean, your work is well documented, the research is there, the data is there, we can see the charts. You and I can, talk this out for, till we're blue in the face, but does it actually change, for example, how this narrative will play out in this election?
Well, I hope that if people are able to understand this history, it will help them see that the immigrant threat narrative is basically wrong. It confuses cause and consequence. So US-born workers have very good reasons to be angry and upset about their deteriorating economic situation, but they should direct that anger not at immigrants, but at the employers and other elites who have restructured the economy in ways that have hurt them. Even if you got rid of all immigrants tomorrow, that situation would not change.
There's a flip side to this, though, too, isn't there, that you talk about in the conclusion of the book, where you say the very stigmatizing of immigrant populations reinforces their, I think you call it a collective worldview, and their tendency to build strong mutual aid networks, kinship networks, and organize, which is what we're going to talk about next.
Right. Well, that no one expected. I think in any of the employers didn't expect it. Organized labor didn't expect it, but that was another consequence. The story of immigration in the United States more generally is full of unintended consequences.
With positive cons as well as pros for organizing, as you suggest in the book. And that's going to be the next topic. Okay. I really appreciate the book. Thank you so much. And I particularly loved you starting it with the British race culture critic Stuart Hall's comment that migration will really be the issue of this century. Ruth Milkman, author, Immigrant, Labor, and the New Precariat, a professor, of course, at the City University School of Labor and Urban Studies. Thank you so much for coming back on the program, Ruth.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be back in just a moment and talk with some of those who are organizing the migrant workforce and the workforce in general in this country, and whose work flies directly in the face of some of what we're hearing in this election run-up. That's coming up here on CityWorks. Stay tuned.
The CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies is the 25th and newest school under the CUNY umbrella. Dedicated to public service and social justice, the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies offers undergraduate and graduate degrees in the areas of labor studies and urban studies, and certificate programs in labor relations, public administration and public policy, healthcare policy and administration, and community leadership. We pride ourselves on being an institution that brings together activists and academics. Find out more at slu.cuny.edu.
Welcome back. And now I'm very excited to be joined by Cristina Jimenez, one of the founders of United We Dream, and Kazi Fauzia. Kazi works as a community organizer with Drum, which is Desi's Rising Up and Moving, right in New York, in Queens. She's also a former seamstress and an organizer from Bangladesh. Let's start with you, Cristina. This narrative that Ruth talked about is very familiar to the people that you work with. Talk a little bit about how you're contesting this story as it's become so central to election 2020.
Well, I think that what the narrative has been is one that has not only just exploited immigrants for their labor, but also criminalize immigrants and people, particularly immigrants of color that have come to this country seeking a better life. So part of the work that we have been doing at United We Dream is to speak about our stories. And using tactics of storytelling and narrative change to really put a face to the issue and to humanize the stories. So for example, for me, as someone who is 13 years old, like many immigrants seeking a better life, I continue to share my story of why my parents came here, fleeing poverty, in Ecuador when in the 1990s, when Ecuador was going through a political and economic turmoil, and growing up undocumented in a place like New York City, and how that had shaped not only the life of my parents and my entire family, but also why I organize today. And, I have to say, Laura, we've seen how things have been changing, not only because we see someone like the president utilizing his platform to fuel hate and a xenophobic narrative, but we've also seen how most Americans today completely disagree with the way in which the president speaks about immigrants. They actually agree on protecting immigrants from deportation, and have now more increasingly supported policies that will stop deportation. So that's some of the work that we've been doing on narrative change.
Thank you. And let me come to you, Kazi Fauzia. You work on the ground, talking to people in your community and outside it. Do you have any examples you could share perhaps of how you were able to contest some of these conventional notions that are also held within communities themselves, sometimes migrant communities?
When I came this country as an undocumented immigrant, I found a seamstress job in Jackson Heights. As an undocumented immigrant, I'm the witness and also suffer how undocumented immigrant treated in this country, how like a unjust way people treat us, like we are not even human. So that's the reason I joined DRUM, and DRUM, the organization who built actually working class immigrant power in this country, and documented, undocumented doesn't matter. But see, when you talk about the election, the same time something going is very, very important. You see the census 2020.
Yes.
The citizenship question, the primary time this administration add, because they want to create more fear and more something. So we scared, so we don't want to be part of the census. And census is very important for us, because this is something they want to de-empower our power. Depopulation means de-empower our power. So we fight a lot to get our citizenship quotient. When finally we done, then COVID-19 came. And now we are struggling same time to see the election fear-mongering stuff in the community, how they are fearful. If Trump came again, what will we do? And another side is we are struggling to count our people. It's like I do every single day outreach in the state. As a 501c, we are not able to talk about election, but when we ask people to census, they talk about election. They talk about, oh, you people are doing voter registration. People have so much fear. If this administration come back again, what will be happen?
Yeah.
The question always, what will be happen? And same time, people are so fearful count themselves. They think if I count, probably they have my address. Like
So just to underscore one more time, the administration lost in the courts. It was not allowed for them to include that citizenship question on the census. People can fill out the census, right? They can answer those questions. But everything you're saying, Kazi, speaks to one of the phenomena that Ruth doesn't talk about in the book, but runs in the same way that so many of the sort of myths do that she writes about. And that's the one about fear of disease. Trump talks about the wall, border security as national security. And sure, he talks about crime and violence and gangs, but he's also increasingly talking about disease and COVID-19 at the same time as he's making sure that immigrants are denied access to healthcare, to benefits. They were denied any of the COVID relief package. How is that playing out, Christina? And how are you addressing that horrible perfect storm of facts?
You know, one of the things that we are aware in our communities is the big problem of disinformation and lies. And when you constantly see lies coming out of Republicans and the Trump administration and the president himself about COVID, about solutions for COVID, about the policies that we have for relief on COVID, we at the community level do the work to confront these lies and to dispel the lies and to ensure that our communities are not falling for it. And you know what we are seeing across the country, even though because of COVID we cannot speak to people door to door or face to face, as we're making phone calls to reach out to voters. As Cassie were saying, we're reaching out to people to get counted. Also, for the census, when we're talking to the community, it is clear to me that our communities are not being fooled by the lies of this president.
And are they getting the health care that they need?
And constantly, well, they're not, right? And so I think that what we're seeing in the immigrant community in particular is that there is fear, but there is also complete absence of the federal government in ensuring that immigrants have access, quite frankly, not only to testing, but what about treatment? What about the folks that have lost their jobs and have no support from the federal government to support families in immigrant communities? So you've seen some of the states taking the leadership to organize funds to support immigrant communities. Immigrant communities are self-organizing with mutual funds, but it is definitely terrible, the situation that we are seeing in terms of the lack of leadership from this administration, which is why we're using the pain in our communities to really have conversations about the stakes in this election and why we are engaging our communities in registering to vote and coming out to vote this November. So this agenda of anti-immigrant hate is defeated.
The flip side of what Ruth was talking about is the capacity of migrant populations and communities to organize and to somehow survive in these times and continue providing services and doing work that's needed in communities. Out of that, do you see organizing strategies and survival strategies that perhaps we're all going to need, no matter who's in the White House going forward? Because certainly shift of personnel in the White House alone is not going to solve these problems. But first, you, Kazi, is there a story that sort of stiffens your spine as you do this work?
So I can say only one word. The 2010 census, I'm here as an undocumented immigrant and out of count because my landlord not allow me to count because I'm undocumented. But this 2020 census, I'm the part of the organizing, and I saw how much people came up in the state still COVID fear, how much people knocking other people door, how much people came up state with the masks and the resources and the food, offer people please count it. I'm going to give you PPE. I'm going to give you food, but count it. People understand how much important populate, count ourselves and build our power. They realize the necessity of the organizing and necessity of the counting and the federal money and run city better, like everything.
Well, that is a great example, because the
right,
census count determines how many resources come to a
come
district,
to the city,
not to
and how we can
specific people,
protect.
not to specific streets, but to an entire district and to the state and to the city. So Christina, that goes to the other point of, are there organizing techniques that immigrant populations and migrants are using in this time to survive that you could see us possibly benefiting from as a country as a whole going forward?
You know, I think that there's one thing that all of us can learn, and I hope that this country is learning from this pandemic. And that is that we are interdependent, like we are not independent from each other. We're so interconnected and depend on each other for our well-being, for our health, to be safe, and to thrive. And that means not just immigrant communities. That means all of us here in this country. And to Ruth's point, I think that one of the most amazing opportunities that we have in this moment is the opportunity to organize across race, across immigration status, across class. And when we just think about the power of people coming together from a working class background who are being the most impacted by COVID-19, who are the ones that are fearing evictions in this moment, who are the ones that don't have food in this moment. I think that there is a powerful opportunity to not only speak about the truth, which is the country has not been working for working class people, not just immigrants, for all working class people, and particularly communities of color. So if it has not been working, the vision that we have is a country that works for all of us, and a multiracial democracy that has yet to be fulfilled. So that is a vision where all of us can thrive. And I think that the biggest opportunity that we have is this cross-sector, intersectional, and interconnected organizing that we can drive together for a country that treats us all with dignity.
And those mutual funds, how do they work?
At United We Dream, for example, we created a mutual fund to provide $400 to undocument the families that were left out by the relief packages from Congress when they were voted on in the last couple of months. And, you know, we raised over $200,000. We're able to help hundreds of families and continue to do this fundraising. And though that is inspiring, and my hope is that we can all be inspired by the self-organizing, I still say, Laura, that we still need government to step in to make sure that this country not only survives, but actually thrives from this pandemic that is harming so much of the economy and communities across the country.
The models that you described remind me so much of the early labor union organizing in this country, mostly white, mostly immigrant, in the early 1800s. Not so different. Kazi, final comments to you. Any, I don't know, we're not coming down and you're not coming down for one candidate or another, but you are coming down for participation. Is it too late for people to get involved in this election in your community?
Like this COVID-19, we lost so much community, we lost so much. We lost a lot of community members. Our loss is really, really big, but this COVID-19 also teaches us how to collectively survive, how to build neighborhood organizing, how to build a block organizing, how we come closer, cross race, gender, ethnicity, everything. We work shoulder to shoulder together to save us, not me or not my family, is us. So this is something, if people want to show their power in the in the election to via their voting rights, they can. But as an organizer, I never believe voting power. I only believe organizing power. So that's why my appeal never for the vote. But people want to show their power in the election, they definitely can show their power. And like a prove this organization administration wrong. They
Kazi,
are totally wrong.
thank you so much. Kazi is joining us from Drum. Desi's Rising Up and Moving. And Christina Jimenez, thank you, also one of the co-founders of United We Dream. Well, that's it for our show, CityWorks, a co-production of CUNY TV and the School of Labor and Urban Studies at the City University of New York. Our guests were Professor Ruth Milkman from right here at CUNY, Christina Jimenez, co-founder of United We Dream, and Kazi Fozia of Drum. For more information or to send us your comments or questions, you can write to us. That's cityworks@slu.cuny.edu. For CityWorks, I'm Laura Flanders. Thank you.